Hello, hello. How's everybody doing today? I heard voices. I think they came from right there. I have two sunlights directly in my face. So if it looks like I'm looking at you, I'm trying to, because I like to make eye contact with the folks that I'm speaking with. But just know that I'm blind up here. It's all right, go. So, but I'd like to thank you for coming to my talk, coming to Stir Trek. This is actually my first time speaking here. Been looking forward to this all week, so it's very lovely. What I'm going to be speaking to you about today is accessibility. By round of applause, how many of you are familiar with accessibility? Good. How many of you work for organizations that support that enthusiasm? Okay, not bad, not bad. So those of you who are aware of accessibility and how it actually works, you also know that the web is still in really bad shape, and we still have a lot of work to do to move everything forward so that we continue to build accessible products for people with disabilities. So what I'm going to speak to you today about is the four principles of accessibility. If you're on Blue Sky, you can find me at circlebox.com. And if you're on Twitter, you can find me at circlebox. So I'm going to go ahead and get into this. These are hazardous, to say the least. I was on my way to go get a tattoo, and this is in Atlanta, where I'm based out of. And as I was walking over to the tattoo parlor, I got to the crosswalk, and we all know that there's the button there to help us get across the street. It's meant to send a signal that'll allow the lights to change in our favor so that we can cross. There are curb cuts there. There are other things that are available to help people with disabilities cross the street safely. However, someone wasn't thinking when they decided to plant a cactus next to the pole with needles that stick out of it. So needless to say, I was drawing blood before I went to get blood drawn from a tattoo just because I needed to cross the street. Unfortunately, we as developers do this all the time when we're writing our code, and we're not taking other people's needs into consideration. So we have the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. It's been around since the 90s. What this does is it lays the groundwork for us to be more aware and cognizant to make sure that if we have services that we are offering to, patrons who come to our brick and mortars, we also have to provide those same level of services within reason online. But a lot of services and products are super slow in catching up to this. ADA.gov just released their new website with the new standards that they're going to be enforcing. That came out earlier this year, and they're supposed to be making a actual decision on how they're going to enforce it. We're all familiar with the lawsuits that are happening across the web because of COVID. It allowed many more people to work online and to do everything that they needed to do online, which is why we started to see a spike in the lawsuits because, websites aren't accessible. Title III specifically deals with carrying your services over to the web. Make your sites accessible. Provide that reasonable access for your goods and services. 15% of the world's population has a disability, but yet there are a lot of people that think that people with disabilities don't use technology. 70 economies around the world have some type of accessibility law on their books. How many times have you heard this? I hear it all the time in my line of work. I do audits and things like that. And I always get someone to tell me, well, people with disabilities don't they don't use our products. It's impossible for them to use it. That's because when they think about someone with disabilities, they see this. Someone using sign language. They see a blind person with a cane and their dog. They think of a person with mobility issues, or they think of someone with prosthetic limbs. They never think about the invisibilities, the disabilities that you don't see, cognitive disabilities. The number one job for people with cognitive disabilities is software development. There are probably some of your colleagues, your teammates, who are neurodivergent, and you don't know. You may never know. Not everyone is comfortable with divulging that information, mainly because of, discrimination and things like that. So we have to be mindful of even the way that we author our code in the workplace. But cognitive disabilities are the number one disability worldwide. Autism, attention deficit disorder, memory loss, dyslexia, long COVID. I actually give a talk on the scientific research of long COVID and how it affects accessibility, because, long story short, TLDR, it creates a scenario for individuals that is like ADHD. And for those who have ADHD, it's worse for them. So with the WCAG, these are the standards that the DOJ points to that we should adhere to when we are building our applications. Currently, we are using the WCAG 2.1. Web content accessibility guidelines. It's broken into 3 levels. It has 4 sections, and I don't have enough fingers, but 78 success criteria. We're not going to go through all of that. We're just going to stick with the 4 sections, and I'm going to explain how those 4 sections apply to software development. So first, it starts with level AA, or level A. Level A is the bare minimum. You're just checking a box here. You've literally, just like this picture, if you're in a wheelchair, come inside and ask and we'll get a ramp for you. That's not helping anybody. You're just checking boxes at this point. Then you have AAA. AAA is the absolute gold standard. And if you are working for a government agency or you get government funding, you probably have to reach for AAA depending on what it is that you're building. But where we want to aim is level AA. That's the sweet spot. This is where you are going to build a product that will meet the wide range of needs for people with disabilities that are using your product or any product in general. Aim for that sweet spot. 4 principles of accessibility. This is at 4 sections that I mentioned earlier. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. What does all this mean? Well, perceivable. Perceivable means that when someone is using your product, they can use their senses to understand and perceive what is going on. You want people to be able to perceive the copy that is on your web page or within inside your project. That way they can read it. You want people to be able to understand and see the UI. You got to make sure that your buttons are visible. You got to make sure that you have captions for text and videos. You want to make sure that your audio is correct. Things like that. Because someone who is able, they're using a screen. Well, you may have someone just on your product or using your product that uses refreshable braille readers. Images don't translate that way. You have to make sure that your content is perceivable, it is digitable, it is accessible to assistive tech. How many do this with their CSS? You'll see it a lot. Take a look at your projects and see if you have outline none anywhere in your CSS. If you do, you just made it very difficult for someone who is a keyboard user or someone who doesn't use a mouse in general to locate where they are in your project when they're trying to navigate. We always advocate, don't do this. A lot of people get upset about it because, designers. I came from a design background. Yes. We don't like the rings, the focus rings that browsers assign to focusable elements. Well, good news. You can actually use CSS to change that. Make it more brand specific. It helps out. The current job where I am now, working at Guru, when I worked with the design team there, they had taken off all the focus rings. Then we had a very long conversation, and I showed them how it improved usability for users who are using keyboards. Now, all of the designers, when they see something that doesn't have a focus ring, it gets under their skin, and they're quick to fix it. Operable. We all use technology in different ways. Just because you use a mouse doesn't mean that everyone else uses a mouse. You have someone who may have type aids to be able to type on a keyboard because they have motor functions or motor disability. Microsoft came out with the adaptive controller for gamers. Gaming and accessibility is huge. And in my opinion, the gaming industry is destroying us on the web because of the way that they're building in these accessible tools into the games that everybody's playing. It's amazing how they're just thinking and making sure that this equity is built in for their users. It's great. We have to be mindful of that. Just because you use your computer in a particular way does not mean that everyone else does. But a lot of people forget this. A study was done at a university over in Australia where they found that 64% of their disabled users who use a screen reader use that to navigate around the website. The screen reader is used for navigation. Designers, we design a happy path that someone is supposed to take, and we think that we gave them the best, most efficient way to get from point A to point B, but our users always find some other workaround. These are the things that we have to keep in mind. Assistive tech is that other workaround for our users. We can't just lock our users into one particular path thinking that that's the only path that is correct. Doesn't work. Headings. You have people who are navigating websites using screen readers. The most efficient way they do it is using headings. When I'm using a screen reader, I'm scanning through the page with headings. But our heading structure on websites is a mess. Often because we don't follow the semantic logic or the logical reading order and use the semantic elements correctly. I see this all the time where I have headings that are all out of order, such as the ones I have here on screen, H3, H1, H2, H1, H5. If someone were actually navigating using the screen reader, instead of them logically following the information down the page, they're now jumping all over. Well, that's a problem because they can lose context of what's being conveyed by your product. So it's best to keep your headings in a logical reading order. 1H1 is the rule. So a lot of people will debate that. They'll say, well, The HTML spec said that you can use an H1 per section. Yeah, but it was never implemented in any of the browsers. As a result, if you do it, you can still break assistive tech, so to speak. So you have to be careful with that. So it's best just have one H1 on your page, as many H2s, H3s as you need, but have them in logical reading order. And one of the big problems with it is because word processing has taught us the incorrect way of using headings. We use headings based on how they look. The largest one and then so forth, going all the way down. Well, if the sizing is incorrect based on the presentation that you have inside your project, that will allow you to get them out of sequential order. So what you don't want to do is style the element specifically. That frees up our designers and developers to use the correct semantic element, but then you use CSS to style a class that you can assign to that element, such as what I have on the left. You have the actual element with a size. Don't do that. Or on the right side, wait, is that your right? Yeah, that's your right. You guys just checking. I actually have class names that speak to what that heading is supposed to be. It describes what that heading is, along with the size. This is a much more flexible way of doing it. Then we have understandable. Understandable means that when people are using your product, you want them to understand what's going on. It's not just can they comprehend the words that you've put on the page, but do they understand what the UI is for? Do they understand what the elements on the page is for, in your app is for? Is it confusing? Anytime you open up a UI and you have questions, that's a failure. That is a friction point. You want to try to reduce friction points, because by reducing friction points, you reduce errors. By reducing errors, you lower frustration. By lowering frustration, you build loyal customers and loyal users. This right here, this is a game that's online right now. It's called User in Your Face. It is awful. So awful. Basically, what they've taken are all the bad patterns that they found online and condensed them into a game that is pretty much like an escape room of web forms. This thing sucks. This first one, that's the barrier to entry. They get worse after this. You have to figure out how to submit this form. True story. I didn't finish it. I gave up. I got too frustrated with it. It looked simple. I thought I understood how this UI worked. So, if you open this up, don't blame me. I'm warning you now. It's mad frustrating. User in your face. Have fun with it. How many times have we seen UI elements, inputs that look like this? See it all the time. Folks don't like to put labels on anything. Well, as soon as you get focus, now what? Take someone who has short-term memory loss, ADHD, a 3-year-old running around. Doesn't have to be a disability. It could be a temporary situation, a temporary impairment, a distraction. So now you've created a friction point here, because the person comes back and they look at the UI and go, oh, what goes here? Oh, yeah, right, name. But they have to remove focus in order to see what the context of the element is. Instead, use your label. That way, when your label or when your input is in focus, the context, the meaning of what this thing is for is there. They still understand what it is that they need to do. Prevents friction, prevents errors, prevents frustration, prevents somebody trash talking you on Twitter. Robust, the last one in the group. You want to make sure that you are building your application so that it meets our users where they are. We know good and well we can't test for every single device that's out there. It doesn't make sense. It's not feasible. It's not realistic. But we do have the tools, starting with semantic markup and so forth, that will allow us to reach the wide range of products that are out there that people use to access digital content. Doesn't matter really what framework you're using. It all goes back to HTML. I'm going to read this one because I've never memorized this because this is a whole lot. But carry on accessibility. She says, I'm a screen reader user and magnification user. Sometimes I feel like the accessibility testing is only for screen readers. Why don't more companies care about display, scaling, font, and accessible for visual layout? Those products that she's referring to are not robust. They are not meeting the users where they are. That designer designed for one particular viewpoint, and that was it. One simple thing that we can do, especially in this day and age, use responsive layouts. How many people here have design teams? Clap. Okay. How many of those designers provide you multiple views for what you're working on? Or do they always start with large screens first? See? My team did the same thing. And I had to educate them. I was like, yeah, you guys are designing on this ultra wide, but not everybody's using an ultra wide. If you use responsive layouts, you'll reduce horizontal scrolling. That affects individuals who use screen magnification and browser zoom. Reduces the need of a wide field of vision. That affects individuals who have low vision. Multi-column layouts, I'll show you later, they negatively impact people with low vision. It's not a good experience for them. And the thing is, it's not just small screens. We've had users who had issues using our UI on MacBooks. 13-inch screens. You would think 1,400 by 900 is enough space. Nope. There were still some parts of the UI that would get cut off or it would cause horizontal scrolling. So we can't just think that every screen that is wide is not affected by the responsive nature of the applications that we're building. So we have to be mindful of that. This is the two column that I was referring to. We're all sitting here, we can see the two columns with no problem. But someone who is using browser zoom or may have a narrow field of vision or is using screen magnification, this is what they see. So now in order to see the rest of the page, they have to use complex key commands to be able to move the screen around so that they can see the rest of the UI. Well, if they have short-term memory loss or ADHD, memory problems, anything like that, as they move through, they could lose context of what's going on. Best thing you want to do is just align it in a single column. Have everything respond so that it flows in a narrow view. This allows them to maintain the context, maintain sight on what it is that they're looking at. Each field is labeled, and you're good to go. I like this quote out of The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Plan for what is difficult while it's easy, and do what is great while it's small. And the way I apply this to accessibility is that you're doing something great while it is difficult to even achieve. That means that you are planning for it ahead of time. Fixing accessibilities early in the process will save you a ton of headaches, unlike when you start to do it after the fact. And that's something that I work with clients about on a regular basis, because they end up spending more in retooling and redesigning because they didn't think about the accessibility solves at the origin of their project. And at the origin of the project, that's when it takes the least effort. It's a smaller effort then than after it goes. So plan for what is difficult. The difficult aspect is the UX, understanding how people use your application. Small changes mean that you are using the semantic elements, the correct code, ahead of time, so you don't have to go back and re-engineer everything later. How do we build these out? Well, we already have the tools. We've had them since HTML1. Now we have HTML 5.2, WCAG 2.1, and we have ARIA 1.1. ARIA gets people in trouble. How many are familiar with WebAIM's 1 Million Web Survey? By round of applause. Okay, so WebAIM, every year they do a survey of the web where they measure the accessibility of 1 million random websites. And the data that it come back with is just jacked up all the way around. As the data shows, 96.3% of those websites have accessibility issues. Horrible. 80% of those websites have those issues because of the incorrect usage of ARIA attributes that are assigned to the incorrect labels, or just using them incorrectly in general. And the problem is this. We've seen people, and you've probably done it yourself. I know I did before I learned. You'll put an on-click on a div. And then you'll put a role equals button, or one that I saw that made me want to just punch people. It was a div with a role equals link with an on-click and no href. And then it had ARIA hidden and a tab index of -1. What that means is that someone with assistive technology, they'd never see it, never. But yet, we have things like this in the wild all the time. 80% of the top 1 million websites have these types of issues. First rule of ARIA, don't use ARIA. It even says it on the website when you go into the rules. If there is something semantic in place that you can use in place of using an ARIA attribute, use that first. And we have to be mindful of over-engineering. Over-engineering is super easy. So what you don't see here is a really elaborate Rube Goldberg for a guy to eat a sandwich. But GIFs don't play in static images. True story. Me over-engineering. Disabled, dimmed. What does disabled mean to you? That's a literal question. What do you think? What is disabled? Can't use it, right? What does dim tell you? Yeah. Disabled describes a functional state, whereas dimmed describes a visual state. Well, this is when I first started using screen readers. I did not know that screen readers reported disabled elements as dimmed. Yeah. So guess what I did? I thought I was helping. I went in and put ARIA labels on all of the buttons. And so that when it was dimmed, I would put disabled inside the ARIA label. So all my screen reader users smacked my hands on that one, rightfully so. But what I also didn't realize is that I broke internationalization, because by using ARIA attributes, the browsers don't necessarily translate those when you get into other regions. You actually have to provide tokens that will change the language that gets put inside of an ARIA attribute. So I created 2 bugs thinking that I was solving one, all because I didn't understand and decided to over-engineer things. Don't do that. HTML5, semantic elements. Semantic elements will get you so many wins from an accessibility standpoint. It's amazing. It's already built in it. Here are some common issues that we see all the time. When do you use a link versus a button? A lot of devs get this wrong. The stats show whenever you manipulate the URL, use a link. Don't think about what it looks like or anything like that. If the URL is changing, it's a link. If you're not manipulating the URL, use a button. Simple as that. You'll be surprised how much you will improve your user experience by doing that. So what happens is that when you come in using a screen readers switch into different modes. You have browse modes, you have form modes. But they also have different ways of triggering those elements. So if you put the wrong element up there, you can confuse the screen reader user, and now they can't access your link because they're using the wrong keystroke to access the link, and vice versa with a button. If you manipulate the URL, it's a link. Don't, button. Don't do this. Spans with on-clicks, nope. Spans don't mean anything. They have no semantic meaning whatsoever. Screen readers will ignore them. Assistive tech will ignore them. Works great for somebody who uses a mouse, horrible for someone that uses a keyboard. Span, roll, button, tab index equals 0. Yeah, that'll work. That's a hack. Don't use that, though. How hard is it to actually just use a semantic button in that place? So if you use a span, you actually have to add roll button, tab index. That's 2 things that you have to remember to put on there. Use a button. It's already built in. It's already natively focusable for assistive tech and anyone using your application. Did I skip through? Yeah. This is another one. This is a small little nuance, a small little detail that I see often in accessibility reviews. You'll see divs inside of a button. That actually goes against the HTML spec. You can't use divs inside of a button. And for modern browsers, it really doesn't mess with them. But for some older tech, it can cause problems for your users. Thing is, you don't know what they're using. That goes against building something that is robust. Instead, use spans. You can walk away with the same results. You can apply classes to the span and do what you need to do. Works just fine. Inputs. Just like the example I showed you earlier, this is an input without a label. We don't want to do that because we're not telling our users what that input is actually used for. Placeholders don't stay there forever. They go away as soon as that element is in focus. You don't want to do that. So instead, you can use an implicit label. I give a warning with this because while implicit labels work, not all of assistive tools work with this. For instance, Dragon by Nuance. It's a voice dictation software. Well, people use that voice dictation software to also navigate the web. I know people who do not have disabilities who use Dragon to control their computer. And when you do this, Dragon will not recognize that that is an input that you can interact with. So instead, you want to do an explicit label. That's where the label exists outside of or above the input, and then you tie them together by using a for. This is a React example, so it's a HTML4, but you want to tie the label to the ID of the input. And now everything is together. It reports back to screen reader users the same way. Everyone knows what they're doing. Tab order. I've seen sites where the developers will add tab index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 because they want to control how keyboard users actually go through. Well, in a responsive environment where you have reflow, that order can get jacked up. You don't want to do that. So instead, what you actually want to do is use a tab index of 0. If you want to remove something from the tabbing structure, you do a -1. But never go above 0. That way, when your screen reflows, everything still stays within a logical tabbing order. Images. Images are really big. Alt text. When you don't add alt text, it's going to read back the name of the image. A lot of times that's just horrible. I don't know if you've ever listened to a screen reader, but it can get really verbose really quick and super overwhelming. Instead, provide your alt text. Company logo, yeah, that's generic. You want to be a little bit more descriptive than that, but that's the example. Use an alt description. When you're dealing with decorative images, that's a different thing too. These are images that provide no real context, but they're just there for the visual presentation of that particular view. And what you could do with that is apply either, you can use either a role equals presentation or aria in equals true. Both work. The extra step is to add an empty alt attribute with it. But these both work to hide this particular image or whatever it is from assistive tech. It works wonders. And after that, you want to test everything. Test everything. We have tools. My tool of choice is Axe by DQ. It's run in so many popular projects. Axe is a great company. They build a great tool. They have a free plugin that runs in Chrome. And if you don't want to run it there, you can also run WebAIM. Does the same thing. Now, two different companies. WebAIM has a more user-friendly user interface that a lot of people like, but I've also found that it can be a little bit noisy. But don't let my opinion color your decision. They're both great tools that can help you understand the accessibility needs for your project. Other tools you can use. VS Code has the Ali linter and an ESLint. Accessibility Insights and Lighthouse. What a lot of people don't realize is that Accessibility Insights and Lighthouse actually run the Axe core in the background. They're powered by that. So you still get the same benefits of using Axe. Screen readers. If you're on a Mac, you have VoiceOver. Everybody has it. If you're on Windows, I suggest using JAWS or NVDA. JAWS comes with a subscription cost. NVDA is open source. It's a great one. I've used NVDA now for probably the past 10 years. So it's definitely my go-to. But we have to get into the habit of using them and understanding how our users use them, because there are a lot of people who do depend on this technology to manage our websites and to just go on and do simple browsing. And last, we have empathy. It requires empathy to build the projects and the products that enable independence for people with disabilities. We need to know what they're going through. We have to understand how they feel. We have to side with them. There's 3 different levels of empathy: cognitive, emotional, and compassionate. Cognitive empathy, our ability to understand what somebody is going through. Somebody explains to you how they're having issues using your product. You're using cognitive empathy. I understand this is a friction point. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. Emotional empathy. Now you're putting yourself in that person's shoes. How would I feel if I could not complete this particular task with inside my application? Okay, that person feels that way. What am I going to do about it? That what am I going to do about it is compassionate empathy. This is when you put your actions towards fixing those problems. These are the 3 steps of empathy that we have to employ when we're building out our projects. And it's not just designers' problems or engineers' problems. It's PMs, it's leadership, it's everyone. Copywriters. When I started working where I am now, our copy was a mess. No shade to the team. It was a mess from an accessibility standpoint. It worked ridiculously well from a marketing standpoint. But once I pointed out how it was, affecting users from a cognitive perspective, our writers jumped right on it and rewrote everything. They even went and got certified to write accessible content. And it was amazing. The content is still marketable, but now our users don't have the same cognitive load when they come to read the content. We have to be mindful of that. So how do we put all of this into work? Perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. What can I see? Perceivable. What can I do? How do I use this application? How do I navigate through this user journey? What is the UX of this particular path? Operable, understandable. Does it work with assistive tech? Testing, using your screen readers. Use your keyboard. When someone comes to me and say, oh yeah, I made this and it's 100% accessible. For me, that's a challenge. And the first thing I do, I hit the tab key. The tab key will tell me the level of support that you have for keyboards in your application. 9 times out of 10, it fails. I did a talk once where there were 2 individuals from a company, and they were saying that their product was accessible. And I asked them, I said, would you be willing to do an audit right now? They're like, sure. Some friends of mine who were sitting there, they were like, oh, y'all shouldn't have did that. I started hitting the tab key, and as I'm hitting it, I'm asking the audience, I'm like, where am I? There was no focus ring anywhere. I could see that it was moving because the URL was popping up at the bottom of the screen. But I could not visually see where I was at all in their UI. And when I looked at the elements, yeah, they used semantic markup, but they had completely removed all the focus rings. You fail accessibility right there. Their faces just turned red. I was like, it's an easy fix, but you got to talk to your designers. They were like, we're on it right now. I'm like, robust, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Thank you for listening.